Hello, I'm Patty Donohoe from the Eastham Historical Society. We're here with Dan Zoto, archaeologist, with whom we've had the distinct pleasure of collaborating with on several projects at the 1869 Schoolhouse Museum and Archives. Most residents of Eastham are familiar with the surnames of the first 7 English purchasers who left Plymouth for the Lower Cape in 1644. Thomas Prince, Nicholas Snow, John Doane, Richard Higgins, John Smalley, Josiah Cook, and Edward Bangs. However, did you know that these 7 were soon joined by 7 more purchasers, also appointed by Governor Bradford? The second 7 were Job and his younger brother Daniel Cole, John Freeman, Samuel Hicks, John Jenkins, Joseph Rogers, and Robert Wixom. These 14 men, their wives, and later their heirs, were the legal proprietors of the common and undivided land within the town's boundaries, which was the land purchased from the Nauset people. The purpose of this film and the next 2 presentations is to bring these individuals from the pages of history to a place where we can better understand who they were and why we should care about them, aside from the fact many of us on the Cape are their descendants. To start with, what did they find when they came here? To begin to answer this question, Dan, we want to take a step further back in time to explore the history of the landscape in Eastham and get an idea of what it may have looked like when they first arrived. You wrote a paper for last year's Mayflower Symposium that presented the idea that Native American land management had a major influence on where the English first settled on Cape Cod, right? I'd like to ask you some questions about this idea and what evidence you found to support it. So first, it's clear that the Native Americans lived on Cape Cod a long time before the English arrived in the 1600s. Do we have an idea of how long Native Americans lived on the Cape?
We do. We do have a pretty good idea of how long Native peoples lived on Cape Cod. And archaeologically, we have evidence dating back some 12,500 years. I'd actually like to take the opportunity, since you asked this question, to give sort of a brief synopsis of the native history of Cape Cod to provide more of a context about what we're going to be talking about today. So the earliest evidence of native peoples on Cape Cod comes in the form of a few isolated spear points, including one from Chatham that dates to between 12,900 and 12,500 years ago. Now, at that time, people were highly mobile hunter-gatherers. They're moving vast distances across the landscape, and the population was generally pretty small. On the Cape, sites of that time are incredibly rare because of that high mobility and the small population density, but also the fact that we are dealing with the sea level rise over the past 12,000 years. So the evidence of the earliest people here is pretty scant. However, after about 8,000 years ago, we start to see a lot of archaeological sites on the Cape, and that represents an increase in the size of the Native American population, but also more intensive land use. By about 3,000 years ago, sea levels have stabilized and the estuary and salt marsh systems that we know today are beginning to form. And those are incredibly important for Native people. And their importance lies in the fact that they provide predictable and concentrated resources. If you take a place like Nauset Harbor, for instance, people living there would have access to sea mammals and fish of the open ocean, shellfish on the mud flats and in the salt marsh, birds that are visiting the salt marsh, and upland animals like deer that are living in the woodlands right adjacent to the marsh. So with all of these resources in a very sort of small area or in close proximity to one another, people were able to settle down and live in a more sedentary way of life. And that begins really about 2,000 years ago. We start to see semi-permanent habitation around the Nauset area. About 1,000 years ago, people include maize horticulture or corn, beans, and squash into their subsistence base. And at that time, we see almost an explosion in the number of archaeological sites around the Nauset area and Cape Cod in general. And that trend of more and larger sites continues all the way up until European contact in the 15 and 1600s. So that's sort of a very brief overview of the Native American history of the Cape.
So they've lived here a long time.
They've lived here for a very long time, a lot longer than the Europeans that came later.
Great, that's really setting the stage a great deal for us to understand that. So I have another question, kind of like that one. You present the idea that Native Americans managed the land that they lived on. And I think I heard you say that a moment ago. In what ways did they alter and or enhance the landscape?
So Native Americans manage the land in several ways, some of which are more important to European settlement than others. And probably the most prominent and dramatic way that natives altered and enhanced the landscape that has consequence for European settlement is through land clearing associated with maize horticulture after that's adopted about 1,000 years ago. So native peoples would clear the forest with stone axes, burn the tops of trees and the trunks, and clear these areas for planting. And once these areas were established as open, they'd be maintained through controlled burning. And this has the effect of having more open land, but it also creates edge environments that are attractive to animals like deer that like to forage on the edges of forests. If you think about the edge of a highway or woods today, that area right at the edge of the forest has a lot of younger plants that are attractive to deer for feeding. As you get into the forest, it's a little more clear and open. Those edge environments are very important. And the fire also will provide an influx of nutrients to the ground, which encourages different plant species, especially those that produce berries. So while the natives are clearing land for planting, they are enhancing and making the areas right around their settlement locations attractive to other animals. So that's one way that they altered the landscape. And one other thing about the fire that's important is it results in forest composition with forest remains of fire-tolerant species, such as oak, which produce acorns, and that also attracts deer and other animals, and people can consume acorns in maybe harder times. So that's one way. Another way that people influence the landscape is through the harvesting of young trees and saplings. And they would do this to construct their wigwams, using young trees for wood, for tools and whatnot, but also to make more substantial structures such as fish weirs. And these can be incredibly large fish traps. I'm not sure, are you familiar with a fish weir?
Oh, yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll explain it for everybody else.
Weirs are, I know, very important, and I think they were also used further on once the Europeans came, were they not?
Absolutely. And, I live near Hyannis, and there are fish weirs out in Nantucket Sound today. Actually, this time of year right now. I'm not sure what they're fishing for, but they're out there. And the technology is somewhat similar. So a fish weir is essentially a fence that is comprised of wooden stakes that's interwoven with brush that is set up in bays and estuaries or across tidal rivers, and it will trap fish that come in with the tide. When the tide leaves, the fish are are stuck behind the weir and they're easier to harvest. And that has a few different effects on the environment. For one, it removes young trees from the forest. And an example I'll talk about the size of some of these weirs. There was one discovered in Boston in the Back Bay that was comprised of 65,000 stakes. So these can be quite large and may have an effect on the environment in that way. And the other way that they affect the environment is they are really good habitat for shellfish like oysters that end up using the weir as anchor points, and they become sort of oyster reefs. And researchers that were investigating that weir in Boston determined that there were more oysters in the bay at the time that the weir was in use than any other time in history, which is really fascinating. And the last way that Native people influence the landscape is actually through harvesting plants. So in some cases, when you harvest plants to eat, if you pick too many, they're gone. Other plants, especially things like cattails, harvesting them actually encourages more growth the next season. So it can have an opposite effect of what you would think. And in other places, more in the Midwest, the selective pressures that were put on these wild plants that were harvested actually led to their domestication. So you have plants like Chenopodium, which is like a wild quinoa, sunflower, squashes that become domesticated in the Midwest through selective harvesting, and then those are later adopted here in the Northeast. And those are some of the plants that end up in the fields that were around native settlements. So there are many, many ways.
That's fascinating. I'm just imagining it. I can almost feel what it was like to be watching them weir fish. Is that what you would call it? Weir fishing?
Weir fishing, yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I've got another one about the landscape. What might the landscape of Cape Cod look like around the time the Europeans arrived? Were they doing some of these same things, and were they observing and copying that? What would they be doing?
That's a great question. I think as far as what the landscape looked like, it was probably a mosaic of more densely forested and sort of untamed areas, and those that were around native habitations that were more open and manicured. If you take Eastham, for example, by 2,000 years ago, you have people permanently living around the Nauset marsh area. Or sort of permanently living around the marshes. They would have been along the coast and the bay in the warmer months, and then moving to places like Great Pond or the other kettle ponds in that area during the colder months or the winter. And these areas are less than a mile apart. So it sort of can be thought of as the same village. It's probably connected by, well-worn paths. And I would assume that all of the area around those locations was probably pretty open and well manicured. It's quite possible that, Eastham from the Atlantic coast all the way to Cape Cod Bay was pretty open and enhanced by native habitation. In contrast, some of the areas that were less densely settled by native people, perhaps the area between Nauset and Wellfleet Harbor, were probably more densely forested, some of which would have had old growth forests, much larger trees than we have today. If you look at pollen studies, they tell that the oak pine forests that we have today were well established by about 1,000 years ago. So I think forest composition was probably very similar to what we have today, although again the trees were probably much larger. The forests we have today are all the result, or second or third generation after colonial deforestation. And we know that in the case of Eastham, the Nauset people were still living here, at least to some extent, when the Europeans arrived. So I would imagine that they were interacting and trading and observing and learning from the people that were here.
Thank you. Oh, that's fascinating. So you point out several examples of how European explorers and early settlers viewed the or the New England landscape. What were they saying? Did they write about these forests and what they observed?
Absolutely, they did. And here on the Cape, we're pretty fortunate to have a pretty robust record of those early writings. The Cape sticks out on the coast. A lot of explorers sailed by here or visited here at one point or another. And when I was conducting the research for the Mayflower Symposium, I was sort of struck by the similarities in the way that the different European explorers described the landscape here, but also how they viewed it. And it seemed like they viewed portions of the landscape, especially around native settlement, as being primed or already ready for European settlement or agriculture. They're continually pointing out things like clearings or desirable tree species, and these all seem to be associated with native settlement. To give some examples, the earliest account that we have of Cape Cod comes from a man named John Brereton, who recorded and sailed with Gosnold on his expedition in 1602.
Okay, 1602.
And he described the Cape as being a mixture of sort of dense woods and more open plains. So sort of that mosaic that I was just talking about. Mm-hmm. And Brereton gives a lot more detail about Martha's Vineyard. And he describes the vineyard as having many meadows and open grasslands. And the forested areas there, he describes as the trees as being very far apart and the forest floor being covered with grasses, which is really interesting. And it's sort of the exact environment that you would expect from an area that is repeatedly burned.
That's interesting.
If you think about the forest floor that we have today, it's covered with leaf litter and other forest detritus. You're not going to have open grassland. But if you're burning that forest on a regular basis, for one, you're going to have fewer trees. You're going to have smaller trees in the understory, and that leaf litter is going to be gone, and that will allow grasses to grow. And Brereton describes this as actually looking to be artificial, which is interesting because I think he was correct in that. Some other accounts that we have is the following year, Martin Pring makes an expedition to get sassafras, and some researchers, including myself, believe that he actually landed in the Truro area. And he describes that area as having a lot of native gardens that are full of, all kind of, it's like corn and then wild berries and things like that. And a really interesting thing about Pring's narrative is the day before he leaves, he witnesses the natives set fire to an area about a mile, an area about a mile in size. And it's a little difficult to attribute that to a scheduled sort of controlled burn because the day before, the English fire their cannon and strike fear in the natives. So who knows if the fire is some sort of a reaction to that, like, burning them out or some other reason to try to get rid of these people. But it demonstrates the willingness of the native people at that time to set these large fires, which I would assume they have some experience doing so. They know it's not going to get completely out of control and whatnot, which is pretty fascinating. I have a few more if you have a moment. All right.
No, it's what's really interesting is just that whole idea of them controlling the fire. I'm really struck by that. That they could control it. I mean, I see that their point of wanting to do it and the purpose for it, just to some degree.
Yeah.
But to be able to
well,
control
it's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know what their ability to control it actually would be, and I wonder if these fires were set based on what they thought about like incoming weather patterns or something like that, because I don't think they would have the ability to put the fire out. But if you're setting a fire in an area that has been previously burned, it's really only going to get so big. I mean, we do control burns today.
Sure. Yeah, we're all familiar, I think, with seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if how much control they would have had to put it out, but it demonstrates an understanding that this is not going to decimate their landscape. So the two other explorers that I want to mention.
Tell us a little more what they said.
They're important for what I'm going to get into later.
Okay.
Is Samuel Champlain visited the Cape in July of 1605 and then again in 1606. And he made a very detailed map of Nauset Harbor in 1605.
Can I pause for a moment? So was he was a cartographer?
He was.
So he was an explorer, and would you also say he was a well-known cartographer, or was that part of what he did?
I believe it was. On these expeditions, his job was to make maps and record details about the landscape and the native people. He was not the ship's captain. And on the second voyage, he actually expresses some frustration with the captain because they spend a lot of time visiting places that they visited the year before.
He was bored.
He was bored, and he thought that they should, they were coming out of Canada, and he thought they should basically go right to the Eastham area where they turned around the year before and then continue to head south. But instead, they explored the coast of Maine again, and then they basically got as far as Chatham. So between the two expeditions, they didn't cover a whole lot of ground the second time. It's really between Eastham and Stage Harbor, and then they head back to Canada. But his map of Nauset is really important. It shows the dispersed village pattern or settlement pattern of individual wigwams and garden plots all around the harbor. And he records that a lot of land was cleared and under cultivation there, and that also native people were using prescribed burns to maintain this land as open. And when I can't remember if it's earlier on in the expedition or on the way back, they sail by Gloucester, Massachusetts. And he describes this area as having a lot of open land that would be a very good place for a large herd of cattle. So again, I see a European viewing the landscape here and the native manipulation of that landscape as being advantageous for European-style farming.
Makes sense.
Absolutely. And the Pilgrims viewed the land in almost the same way. When they are first exploring the Outer Cape, they're making note of places that are already cleared for agriculture, some of which they describe as being 50 acres in size. And when they are debating on a place to settle, they were really thinking about Provincetown because of the good harbor there and all of the good corn ground that was already cleared, some of which they describe as being fit for the plow. So again, it's really showing their view toward the landscape and native land management as being helpful to them and their settlement. And we know that they ultimately did not settle here. They moved on to Plymouth. And one of the major reasons they chose that was the amount of land that was already cleared. And, that's advantageous for a few reasons. For one, you don't have to spend the time clearing the forest to build houses or clear fields for planting, pasture animals, all those things. It's already done. And, I think they had a lot of other things to worry about, and that was sort of one less thing.
Got it. Wow, that's an interesting answer to the question. I really appreciated all of that. So you indicate that the earliest English settlements on the Cape, including Eastham, followed the existing Native American settlement pattern. And you covered that quite not well. Do you think this was the case?
I do.
I mean, I'm kind of getting that idea from you.
Absolutely.
How much do you believe it, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I wrote a paper on it.
Yeah.
No, I do, and it's interesting. I didn't go into the research so much with that idea. Someone had told me about the Mayflower Symposium, and I was trying to think of a subject that I could present on. And I'm an archaeologist. I'm interested in the physical past. I'm interested in Native Americans, and I really wanted to bring the Cape's long Native history into the symposium. It was a celebration of the Pilgrims arriving 400 years ago, but I kind of wanted to say, there were people here, and there's a long history before the Pilgrims arrived.
Absolutely.
And in conducting some of that research, I really came across I determined that I think that Native American land management had a major influence on the early English settlement in Plymouth Colony, for a lot of the reasons that I just talked about. But
so the evidence wasn't just what we saw in that drawing.
No,
that was done. What other evidence is there?
So there's
archaeologically.
Well, there's both. I'm going to go both ethnographically and then archaeologically. Okay. So we know that when the English were learning about the landscape here in what was Plymouth Colony, they were being led by native guides that were using the existing native trail system. And this trail system would have led to places of native habitation, some of which was recently abandoned because of disease and much lower. Or if Native people were living here, I think the populations were a lot lower because of European diseases that came before the Pilgrims. So the English were learning about the landscape through sort of a native bias. And we know that a lot of these major native trails, one of which that ran from like the Barnstable Harbor area to Town Cove, Town Cove in Orleans, later became Route 6A. And that happens to link the earliest English settlements. If you look at the archaeological record, the places with the highest densities of archaeological sites on the Cape and that had the biggest native populations at the time of contact are places along Barnstable Harbor and Nauset. And those are the locations of the earliest towns. You have Sandwich in 1637, Barnstable and Yarmouth in 1638, and then Eastham in 1644. And I think with being the places that had these large native populations, they were probably the areas that were the most manicured and already open here on the Cape. Archaeologically, we see some of this evidence in a few different ways. I'm trying to think of where I want to start here. I think some of the best evidence actually comes from a place called Taylor Bray Farm in Yarmouth.
Oh, I'm familiar with
in
that.
Yarmouthport.
Yes.
They had an ongoing archaeological project for many years there that was conducted by the Plymouth Archaeological Rediscovery Project, and it was focused on the Richard and Ruth Taylor homestead, which is a circa 1640 house that existed on that property. And they also investigated Native American land use there. And they found evidence of Native Americans living at Taylor Bray dating back about 10,000 years, which is pretty amazing. The most recent native occupations there were during the contact period. And that was evidenced from an arrowhead that was made of English flint and some pottery that seemed to date to like the 15 or 1600s. Another thing that was found at Taylor Bray, which is probably the most interesting and sort of compelling evidence, was a Native American storage pit that happened to contain a cow bone. So
would you say that again?
It happened to contain a cow bone, or a
cow bone.
A bone, yes.
Okay, what part of the cow? I know that's just a detail.
I believe it was a radius.
So do we have those in some museum? Are those
I believe
those things that you mentioned?
I believe they're at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. Some might be on display in Yarmouth right now. They may still be being analyzed by the Plymouth Archaeological Rediscovery Project also.
So the cow bone was in the pit?
Was in the storage pit, which is really interesting. And that,
yeah, what was it doing there? What do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I think the archaeologist that excavated it thought that it may have been placed there in some ceremonial way. We're not sure, but it clearly dates to the Native occupation, and it helps date that final Native occupation at the farm, in the sense that we know cattle arrived in New England in 1623, and we know that Richard and Ruth Taylor constructed a house there about 1640. So we have about a 17-year window where that storage pit could have been made and the cow bone could have been placed in it. And that shows a very quick succession between natives living on that piece of property and the later Europeans. And I would assume that, based on that storage pit, which was probably used to store corn over the winter, the native people that were living there were engaged in some kind of agriculture, like most others were at that time, that when the Taylors arrived to that area, they found it to be relatively open and clear. It was within a decade or less than 2 decades of the last native people to be living there. And I have a feeling that the fact that that land was open and cleared and well manicured was probably a major reason why they chose that specific location for their homestead. And I think that's something that plays out over and over again on the Cape. And again, if you look at the earliest towns, they seem to be associated with areas of large Native American settlement.
Wow, that all makes a lot of sense. I mean, and the fact that there are some tangible proofs, to the things that you brought up. I know there's not a lot of it. It's so long ago, but still, the fact that we do have some of those, the cow bone really, that's really captured my imagination. It's
pretty amazing. That in the European flint, the arrowhead is really interesting too, right? Yeah, I mean that stone was either acquired through trade with Europeans, or it was picked up on a beach. A lot of times the Europeans would fill their ships with stone and rubble for ballast, and when they got here, they dumped the ballast over the side and filled their ship with lumber or other goods to bring back to Europe. And some of those ballast piles include flint, which is very common in Europe, but doesn't exist here in America. We have a similar stone called chert, but it's not the same. So when you find something made of European flint, you know it dates to that contact period.
That is
cool.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So that's the evidence of these past Native American landscapes.
That's one. There's other general evidence or physical evidence of natives using fire to clear the land and plant corn. I can get into some of that if you'd be interested.
Please. I'm really interested in the corn, because we all know that they grew corn, right?
Yes.
That this was something
we did.
That
they did, yeah.
The Pilgrims said, "Oh, this is good stuff. We're going to do this."
So corn and archaeology is really interesting, because if you think about a cob of corn, it's organic material. It's not going to survive in the ground for hundreds of years. Excuse me. It's really hard to find corn archaeologically.
So in that pit, there was no corn?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
But it's the type of pit that would be used to store corn. However, there are places on the Cape where corn has been found, and probably one of the the most important and amazing archaeological sites on the Cape is a native cornfield in Yarmouth that was covered over by a sand dune. So I don't know if the field was active at the time or had been recently abandoned, but it was covered with this sand dune, and that preserved the individual corn hills. It was really cool. So that site is in Yarmouth, and I'm trying to think the best way to say this. The layout of that site had the cornfield with the individual corn mounds and evidence of a wigwam right next to it, which is almost exactly how Champlain depicted these dispersed native villages, like the one in around Nauset, where you have the individual wigwam and the adjacent garden plot. So it's really interesting to find that archaeologically, and it is sort of a testament to Champlain's accuracy in his recordings. And we know he was probably one of the most accurate of the European explorers. So if you think about how accurate he was, and you sort of take his map of Nauset at face value, and then compare it to other maps that he made in New England, you can get more insights into what Eastham might have looked like compared to other places. And what I'm thinking of is in Champlain's map of Stage Harbor, and also the one he drew in Plymouth, he depicts areas sort of away from native habitation with these very dense clusters of trees that probably represent a dense forest. They don't appear anywhere on the map of Nauset. And if we look at the archaeological record, Nauset is probably one of the most intensely used places in pre-contact times on the whole Cape. Therefore, it's probably one of the most cleared and most manicured. So I think that, when settlers arrived in Eastham, they found a place that was pretty hospitable to them.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
They didn't come to this untamed land.
No.
It had been tamed.
It had, absolutely, or at least portions of it had. I think that the way native settlement was sort of discontinuous, it made not all areas as attractive to Europeans for settlement. And again, I think that's why the earliest towns happen to be in the same places of native villages.
That makes a lot of sense, and it also makes us feel like there was a pattern before that was established, that worked here. Maybe it wasn't the English garden that they had come from, in the old world, but they came to this place, and that this land had already been used in a certain way. So there still were some forests.
Absolutely.
It wasn't all gardens. But
No, it wasn't. And I think, again, that's one of the most important parts, where those open areas, and especially ones that had been either abandoned or the native people were gone because of disease, it presented opportunities for the English to settle in those locations, and it guided them to specific places like Eastham.
Because I know that in some of the early records that we have of these early settlers, these 14 men and their children, wives, that there's evidence that, I don't know how to put it. There's evidence that there were meadows. I've seen, they bought and sold land like candy.
Yes.
I mean, that's one of the things I've noticed in my research of this second 7. They bought and sold the land constantly with one another, and they had to be qualified. They couldn't just sell it to any person. They had to be freemen. They had to be, people of means. And I'm thinking that, as I listen and think about the records that I've read, there were meadows, there were places near the water, those kinds of territories, different territories according to the land. And I'm wondering, if those meadows were planned. That's what I'm thinking as you're talking.
They absolutely might be.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they They certainly could be places where native people had planted before. Sometimes meadow is used to describe areas like salt marshes.
Ah, so maybe the meadow.
It could be that, which is also...
I never saw salt marshes mentioned
Yeah.
in the land purchases. I can't think of one.
Yeah, so I think that might be referring to that, which is also, were also places that were important to Native Americans and then later to the English. The grasses in the salt marsh could be used to feed your livestock. Again, if you look at places where the earliest English towns are, they're some of the largest marshes on the Cape. But those were also extremely, advantageous and they were extremely productive environments that were used by native peoples also.
So you also saying that the English chose these places specifically because of the development that had occurred before?
I think that plays...
Or was that just part of it?
I think it's one of the major reasons. So when you're looking for a place for settlement, you need a fresh water source. The English needed access to the ocean for transportation. They needed a good harbor, and they needed land for planting and for pasturing their animals. If you find that land to be already cleared, that's an advantage to choosing that area.
Certainly.
It happened to be, I think, that native peoples are already settled in areas that are extremely productive environments, like next to salt marshes with nice freshwater sources. However, generations of Native Americans living in an area also enhances that environment. Like I mentioned, the fire would create more desirable plant and tree species. And I don't know if I said it earlier, but one of those fire-tolerant trees are oak trees. And, they are sort of a prime timber species. If you're going to make houses, it's some of the best firewood around. So I think that these places around native settlements were, had many very redeeming qualities.
Excellent.
In the natural world, and then I think that the native life enhanced them also.
That's an excellent description of all that. And is there anything else you want to talk about as far as what these people were coming to? I see a lot of the interaction with the natives was crucial. They bought the land from them, and they lived there. From what I know, there's some 500 people were here in 1644 that were natives.
Still living in Eastham.
And they were still living in Eastham, or Nauset, which would become Eastham in 1651. So I guess I'm trying to picture how that would be. And is there any more evidence of their interaction, perhaps, other than being an example? I mean, do we have anything tangible?
That's a great question. And it's thinking about the archaeological record. It's interesting that we have a lot of documentation from the 1600s, but finding physical evidence of the interaction between native peoples and Europeans is actually pretty rare.
So it's all anecdotal.
No, it's not. There are
Okay.
sites in Eastham where there are European metals associated with Native American sites. I believe there are examples of glass beads and things like that are on these native sites that represent trade. And we know about that trade from the written record. It's during the study of Taylor Bray Farm, it was unclear if some of the Native American pottery that was found near the Richard and Ruth Taylor house was from that previous occupation, or if perhaps it had been the result of trade between Europeans and Native peoples. I also know of another site in Marshfield, Massachusetts, which was a house that burned down in the 1630s. And within that burned structure, I can't remember how many, but I think there's at least one Native American pot, and that was interpreted as a piece of native pottery that was traded to that early colonial settler. So I think there certainly were interactions, and there are other examples in the written record of, that Europeans would have essentially starved if it wasn't for the natives helping them to, with trading corn and whatnot, and showing them how to plant these crops that grew here and whatnot.
Thank you, Dan, for these amazing insights. Our next presentation will be via Zoom July 8th at 7 p.m. when you'll have the opportunity to meet a descendant of Job and Daniel Cole. A link has been provided on the Eastham Historical Society webpage and Facebook page. We hope to see you there.